If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have told you I had a good marriage. Nothing flashy or dramatic. Just a steady 20 years with my wife, Sarah. After that long, you figure you know each other inside and out, that there aren't any real surprises left. We're in our 60s now, and I'm a man who's been happy enough with a simple life, side by side with the woman I'd promised to grow old with. But recently, things had started to feel different. It wasn't anything big, just small things. Little changes that would have slipped by if I wasn't paying close attention. Sarah had been distant, a little distracted. She'd say she was working late, a lot more than usual, or out with friends I hadn't met. I'd ask about her day, and she'd brush it off like it wasn't worth mentioning. Then there was the ring. Sarah had this ring she'd worn every day since we got married, a simple gold band. She loved that ring, used to joke that it was like a second skin. But recently, she'd started leaving it on her dresser. I noticed one night when I saw it lying there, catching the bedroom light as I walked by. The next morning, it was still there, and she went out without it. I didn't say anything, but that unsettled feeling just grew. I watched her come home a few nights in a row, ringless, saying she'd been busy with work. That ring kept coming back to my mind, almost like a warning bell. It was so unlike her, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was nothing, just some midlife shift. But seeing that empty spot on her finger again and again, I knew I had to find out the truth. I couldn't get the sight of that ring out of my mind. It seemed like such a small thing, but it gnawed at me. Sarah was someone who valued her routines. She was a creature of habit. That ring had been with her through every moment, every day of our lives together. And now, for some reason, she'd stopped wearing it. At first, I told myself it was just a coincidence. But after the third or fourth time I saw it lying on the dresser, untouched, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The late nights continued, too. She was out more and more, working late, or meeting up with friends she never mentioned by name. I thought about asking her, but a part of me hesitated. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I'd seen friends over the years jump to all the wrong conclusions, and I knew what suspicion without proof could do to a marriage. But then I noticed something else. One night, she came home with a shopping bag from a high-end boutique, someplace in the city I'd never heard of. Now, Sarah liked nice things, but she'd always been sensible with money, never splurging unless she had a reason. When she left the bag on the table to answer a call in the other room, I found myself glancing inside. Just a quick look, I told myself. I saw a sleek, black cocktail dress still wrapped in tissue paper. Now, I don't know about other men, but I know what clothes my wife wears and where she wears them. A cocktail dress was unusual for Sarah. She wasn't the type to go out to fancy dinners or dress up without a reason. We hadn't gone anywhere formal in ages, so the thought of her buying a dress like that without telling me, well, it left me wondering. She wasn't a secretive person, or so I'd thought. When she came back, I casually asked, "What's the occasion?" She looked startled for a moment, then recovered and shrugged it off, saying it was just something she liked. Her voice was so casual it felt almost forced. It reminded me of how people speak when they've rehearsed their lines. I didn't press her on it. I didn't want to come across as paranoid, but I made a mental note to keep an eye out. I was in uncharted territory here, and I didn't know what to expect. Days went by, and each one seemed to bring more questions than answers. Every time I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, something else would happen to make me question her. She'd step away to take phone calls, her voice low, then come back with a vague excuse. And that dress, I never saw her wear it. I'd looked for it in her closet, but it was nowhere to be found. It was like she was hiding things from me on purpose, dropping crumbs just out of reach. But the final straw came one Saturday night. Sarah was working late again, something that had become more common than I was comfortable with. The house was quiet, just me and my thoughts. I've been going over every little detail in my mind, running through the moments that didn't add up, try to figure out if it was all in my head or if something was actually going on. Finally, I decided enough was enough. I grabbed my keys, got in the car, and drove to her office. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only a few cars scattered here and there. But her car wasn't one of them. I checked the building entrance locked. The lights were off, and the whole place was as quiet as a graveyard. My stomach twisted as a strange sense of dread crept over me. I circled around the block, hoping maybe she'd park somewhere else. Nothing. Then, on a hunch, I drove around the city, following the route she'd usually take home, peering into restaurants, cafes, even a couple of those trendy cocktail lounges she always seemed a bit too eager to mention. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I kept driving. After about an hour, I finally spotted her car parked in a side street, just outside a small, dimly lit bar. My heart started pounding, and my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached. I couldn't believe it. She was in there, somewhere, in a place she'd never mentioned to me, without a single word about it being just another late night at work. I sat in the car, watching the entrance, feeling a strange mix of anger and heartbreak. I watched people come and go, laughing, drinking, having a good time while I just sat there, waiting to see if she'd come out. Then, I saw her. Sarah stepped out, laughing, and beside her was a man I'd never seen before. He was tall, well-dressed, and looking at her in a way that made my blood boil. She looked at him, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years, a look I thought was reserved for me. They lingered outside, talking, her hand resting on his arm, and then they both walked to his car and drove off. I didn't follow. I just sat there, the reality sinking in, feeling like my whole world had come crashing down. I didn't know who she was anymore. This wasn't the woman I'd spent the last 2 decades with. This was someone else, a stranger wearing the face of the woman I loved. As I drove home that night, one thing became clear. I needed to find out just how deep this betrayal went. And if she thought she could keep playing me for a fool, she had another thing coming. After that night, I couldn't shake the image of Sarah laughing with that stranger, looking at him in a way she hadn't looked at me in years. It was like something in me had shifted, like I'd crossed a line and there was no going back. I wasn't just suspicious anymore. I knew something was wrong, and I needed answers. The next morning, I played my part. I acted normal, maybe a bit quieter than usual, but nothing that would raise her suspicions. Sarah was her usual self, or maybe a version of herself, someone I wasn't sure I knew anymore. I wanted to confront her right then and there, to ask about the man outside that bar, about the dress, the late nights. But something held me back. I knew if I went at this head-on, she'd spin it somehow, make it seem like I was overreacting, maybe even twist things to make me feel guilty. Instead, I decided to play the long game. I'd gather proof, real, undeniable evidence, and confront her with it when she couldn't escape. I didn't want just a confession. I wanted the whole picture, every secret she thought she'd kept hidden from me. And maybe a small part of me wanted her to see that she hadn't fooled me at all. I started with the obvious, her phone. Now, Sarah wasn't the type to leave her phone unattended, but every now and then, she'd set it down to shower or step outside to water the garden. One evening, while she was out back, I picked up her phone and tried to unlock it. I knew her passcode, at least the one she'd used last year. But she'd changed it. I felt my pulse quicken. She'd never changed her passcode before. There was another thing, too. She'd started putting her phone on Do Not Disturb mode at night. She'd laugh it off, saying she just needed a better night's sleep without all the alerts. But I knew better. I hadn't lived with this woman for 20 years without noticing when she changed her habits. So, I started looking elsewhere. I checked the family computer. She wasn't exactly tech-savvy, and I figured if she'd been messaging someone, maybe she'd slipped up somewhere, maybe left something behind in her email or search history. But she'd been careful, wiping her browser history clean as if she had nothing to hide. Except that no one really wipes their history unless they have something to hide. And then I noticed something strange in her emails, specifically what wasn't there. She'd always had these weekly work newsletters, messages from clients, and a few old college friends she kept in touch with. But it was like half her inbox had disappeared, as if she'd taken time to clear it out, piece by piece. But why? There was nothing about her work or her old friends that she'd ever hidden from me before. The next morning, Sarah mentioned she'd be out late again, some excuse about last-minute deadlines for a project she'd never mentioned before. She was getting sloppy, and the more she lied, the more confident I felt in my plan. I'd bide my time and keep playing the role of the trusting husband until I had everything I needed. But there was one last thing, something that bothered me more than the missing emails or the late nights or even the man at the bar. It was something small, but it haunted me. One evening, as I was getting into bed, I noticed a stack of bank statements on the kitchen counter. We had a joint account, And while I wasn't the kind of guy to watch every dollar, I like to keep an eye on things now and then. But these statements, they weren't from our regular bank. They were from an account I didn't recognize. Curious, I picked them up and skimmed through the transactions. My heart stopped. They were withdrawals, large ones, thousands of dollars over the past few months. I kept flipping through, my hands shaking as I read line after line. Each one a reminder of money I hadn't known was missing. The account wasn't in her name, either. It was under some company, a name that meant nothing to me. But there was one name that kept showing up: Benjamin Fine, Consultant Services. And every deposit, every large withdrawal, led back to this consultant. It was like she'd been paying someone off, month after month, with amounts that didn't add up to anything I knew about. Who was Benjamin Fine? And what was he consulting her about? I didn't confront her about the money right away. I felt that if I pressed her too soon, she'd just cover her tracks more carefully. I wanted to know exactly what she was hiding, and I needed a plan that would let me see the whole picture. As I lay awake that night, I realized that this was no ordinary affair, no run-of-the-mill cheating. There was a reason she'd taken the trouble to hide her tracks so well, to lie with so many details. This wasn't just about sneaking around. This was something bigger, and I was going to find out exactly what it was. The money withdrawals had been the last straw. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than a simple affair, more than just sneaking around. Sarah was doing something behind my back, something that had cost us a good chunk of our savings. I didn't know who Benjamin Fine was or what consultant services even meant in this context, but the trail was clear. She was hiding something important. That night, I could barely sleep. I was up, staring at the ceiling, mind racing through every moment, every word she'd said over the past few months. I'd never known my wife to be so secretive. She'd always been responsible, the one I trusted to handle our finances, to keep us steady. But now, every assumption I'd ever had about her was slipping away. The next morning, Sarah left early for an all-day work conference. She said she wouldn't be home until late, with an apologetic smile that somehow felt hollow. But I didn't complain. In fact, I felt a strange sense of relief when she walked out the door. I had the house to myself, and I was determined to make good use of the time. I started in her home office. I'd never had any reason to snoop before, so I wasn't sure where to look. I opened drawers, flipped through notebooks, looked behind books on the shelf. Most of it was the usual: work documents, family photos, random knickknacks. But tucked in the bottom drawer of her desk, under a stack of file folders, I found something interesting: a new leather-bound planner. When I opened it, I saw dates and times scribbled throughout, but they weren't the usual kind of notes. These weren't regular meetings or reminders. Many of them were places, locations I didn't recognize. There was Wilkins Plaza, Rutherford Cafe, 530 Main St, and so on, all listed for times when she told me she was working. I felt my heart racing, each entry confirming my suspicions. Some of the dates even matched the times I'd seen those withdrawals from her secret bank account. She'd been meeting someone, and I was willing to bet it was whoever this Benjamin Fine was. I decided it was time to bring in some help. My old college buddy, Tom, was the only person I trusted enough to tell. Tom was the opposite of me: sharp, no nonsense, and always had a plan. He made a career in private security and knew his way around surveillance. If anyone could help me uncover the truth, it was Tom. When I called him that afternoon, I kept it brief, just telling him I suspected Sarah was hiding something big. I didn't go into details, and he didn't ask. He just said, "Meet me at O'Hara's pub tomorrow noon." I was grateful he didn't press for details over the phone, and I hung up feeling slightly calmer. That night, Sarah came home later than usual, practically sneaking through the door. I sat in the living room, pretending to be absorbed in the evening news, while my mind was miles away, replaying each moment from earlier that day. She gave me a distracted wave as she passed by, muttering something about being tired from the conference. But I'd seen something she didn't realize. As she headed down the hall, I caught a glimpse of her hand. She was holding a small envelope, but the second she noticed me looking, she slipped it into her purse. I couldn't make out much, but I saw enough to know it was thick, like there was something important inside. I didn't sleep much that night, either, and as soon as morning rolled around, I headed out to meet Tom at O'Hara's. The bar was nearly empty, just a few old-timers nursing their morning coffee and the bartender half asleep. I spotted Tom in a corner booth, nursing a black coffee, no frills, as usual. He looked up, took one glance at my face, and nodded. "Mike, you look like hell." "Thanks," I said, sliding into the booth. "I feel like it." We didn't waste time on small talk. I laid everything out, from the late nights to the hidden account to the name Benjamin Fine. Tom listened, never interrupting, his face a mask of calm while my nerves were raw. When I finished, he leaned back, arms crossed, considering everything I'd told him. "I've seen cases like this before," he finally said, "but this one sounds different." "What do you mean?" "Usually affairs are messy, impulsive. But this? It sounds calculated. She's covering her tracks, careful, deliberate." "Exactly," I said. "And that's why I need your help. I don't just want to know if she's cheating. I need to know who this guy is and what they're up to." Tom nodded, already making plans. "Okay, I'll start digging. We'll find out who Benjamin Fine is and why he's worth Sarah risking everything." He handed me a small voice recorder. "Keep this on you and turn it on whenever she starts talking about her late nights. Could give us something to work with. And if you can, try to get a look at her phone. We need every scrap of information we can get." I felt a strange sense of comfort in Tom's confidence. I'd been feeling lost, alone in this mess. But with him in my corner, I finally felt like I had a fighting chance. "Mike," he said, his tone suddenly serious, "whatever you find out, be ready. I've seen good people ruined by less. If she's hiding something big, you have to prepare yourself for whatever it is." "I'll be ready," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. I just knew that whatever Sarah was hiding, I was done being kept in the dark. As I left the bar, recorder in hand, I knew this was just the beginning. Whatever secrets Sarah had hidden, I was going to find them. Tom's words stuck with me long after I left the bar. "Whatever you find out, be ready." The truth was I didn't know if I was ready, but I was past the point of turning back. I couldn't just sit around waiting for the next late night or flimsy excuse. I was done with letting Sarah lead me on. It was time to get my answers. That evening, I waited until Sarah was in the shower to take my first step. I found the voice recorder Tom had given me and slipped it into her purse, buried under a few of her belongings so it wouldn't be easy to find. It was a gamble, but I had to try. If she was meeting someone, maybe I'd finally get a clue from her conversations, even just a name or a location. The next day, as Sarah left for work, I watched her go with a strange sense of anticipation. She'd been cold, distant, even more so than usual. And as I watched her drive off, I wondered if she suspected anything. But if she did, she didn't show it. That evening, I felt a nervous energy as I waited for her to come home. I told myself I wasn't expecting much, just hoping the recorder would pick up something useful. But what I found surprised me. After she fell asleep, I slipped into the garage and retrieved the recorder from her purse, heart pounding. I played back the recording on my computer, careful to keep the volume low. Most of it was muffled sounds, the car door closing, maybe the faint hum of her radio. But then about halfway through, I heard her voice. "Fine, I understand, but this needs to be done quickly," she said, her voice cold, almost businesslike. There was a pause, and then she added, "Yes, I know. He's starting to notice things, and I can't risk it." I felt my chest tighten, my mind racing as I tried to process what she'd said. He's starting to notice. There was no doubt in my mind that he meant me. But who was she talking to? And what exactly were they getting done? I rewound it and listened to her words again, the cold, calculated tone that felt like a slap in the face. This wasn't my Sarah, the woman I'd loved, trusted for 20 years. This was someone else entirely. Whoever she was talking to, it was clear they'd been planning something. Something that involved me. The next day, I called Tom and told him what I'd found. "She knows I'm on her," I said, barely keeping my voice steady. "I don't know what she's planning, but I can't sit around and wait for her next move." Tom was quiet for a moment before he responded. "Sounds like she's on edge. That could work to our advantage. People get careless when they're afraid of being caught." "I hope you're right," I said, feeling a surge of determination. "What's our next step?" "Let me take care of finding out who this Benjamin Fine is," Tom said. "In the meantime, if you can keep your cool, act like nothing's wrong. If she thinks you're in the dark, She'll keep making her moves, and we'll be watching. So, that's what I did. I went back to pretending, smiling, asking her about her day, and acting like the clueless husband she must have thought I was. Every time she left for another late night or work meeting, I wanted to confront her, to shout that I knew what she was up to, that I knew about her secrets. But I held back, determined to get the full picture first. Meanwhile, Tom worked his contacts, digging into every detail he could find about Benjamin Fine. He called me a few days later with a lead. Benjamin was a local consultant who had a reputation in certain circles. He wasn't the kind of consultant you'd hire for a business problem. He was known for solving personal issues, handling things that required a level of discretion. What kind of things? I asked. Usually affairs, Tom said. A few cases of fraud. This guy doesn't just offer advice, he offers solutions. Expensive ones. Solutions? I asked, feeling a chill down my spine. Think private investigator meets fixer, Tom explained. If someone has a problem they can't solve themselves, he steps in to help for a fee. And from what I've found, once he's involved, things tend to get complicated fast. The pieces were falling into place. Sarah had been paying this man, who knows how much, for months, maybe more. And if he was the type who handled affairs and other unsavory issues, that meant she'd hired him for something big. But what? To protect herself from me? To cover up her affair? Or worse, was she trying to dig up something on me? My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. But one thing was clear. Sarah was in deeper than I'd realized. She'd hired a man with a shady reputation to deal with something she was desperate to keep hidden. And the longer this went on, the clearer it became that I was her target. For now, I'd play the part of the oblivious husband. I'd watch her carefully, record every lie, every excuse, until I had enough to confront her. But more than anything, I needed to figure out exactly what Benjamin Fine was doing for her, and what their endgame was. And once I knew, I'd be ready to make my move. The revelation about Benjamin Fine had shaken me. Sarah had gone to the trouble of hiring this so-called fixer behind my back, paying him off in secret. What on earth could she be so desperate to keep hidden that she'd hire someone like him? I felt like I was grasping at straws, piecing together fragments of a life I no longer recognized. But I knew one thing. If I was going to bring down her whole operation, I needed more evidence. That night, while Sarah was out again, I went through her office with new purpose. I started by checking her email, hoping maybe she'd slipped up and left something behind. When I opened her laptop, I expected to see the usual clutter, but instead, I found everything wiped clean. The desktop was empty, not a single document or shortcut in sight. She'd clearly gone to great lengths to cover her tracks, but I wasn't ready to give up just yet. Next, I moved to the drawers. I rifled through old bills, receipts, random scribbles, anything that might point me in the right direction. And then, tucked inside an old book, I found a piece of paper with a series of dates and numbers on it. Each date corresponded to one of the meetings she'd mentioned over the past few months. And the numbers, well, at first they looked like some random codes, until I realized they were bank deposit amounts. Each one matched the large withdrawals I'd seen on her hidden bank account statements. This was something concrete, a trail she hadn't erased. But it still left one major question unanswered. What was she paying Benjamin Fine to do? There had to be more, something that tied it all together. And, as far as I could tell, that something was still out there, carefully hidden. Over the next few days, I continued to play the role of the clueless husband, biding my time while I waited for another opening. Sarah carried on as usual, giving me the same empty excuses. But now, I started to see her in a different light. Every smile, every laugh, it felt like an act, a mask she wore to cover up what was really going on. Then, a week later, I had my first real breakthrough. Sarah had left her phone charging on the kitchen counter, a rare slip-up. She'd set it to silent, probably to avoid any suspicious calls interrupting us, but she hadn't locked it. I glanced around, heart pounding as I picked it up and opened her messages. Most of it was the usual, a group chat with her friends, a few family messages, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I saw a message thread with an unsaved number. I scrolled up, my hands shaking as I read the messages. They were brief, almost cryptic, but unmistakable in their meaning. Everything's set. He won't know until it's too late. I don't want any loose ends. This has to be clean. As long as we stick to the plan, it'll all work out. I felt the blood drain from my face. The messages weren't incriminating on their own, but knowing what I did about Benjamin, they painted a disturbing picture. She wasn't just covering up an affair. This was something far darker. But what was her plan? And who was she working with to make sure I'd never know? That evening, I called Tom. He listened quietly as I told him what I'd found, his silence unnerving. Finally, he let out a low whistle. Mike, this is bigger than we thought. You're not dealing with just an affair. This sounds like a setup. She's planning something, and it doesn't sound good. What do I do, Tom? I asked, feeling more lost than ever. If she's trying to set me up, I need to know how far she's willing to go. We need more evidence, Tom said firmly. You've got pieces of the puzzle, but we need the full picture. Whatever she's planning, she'll slip up eventually. We just have to catch her in the act. So that's what I did. Over the next few weeks, I gathered every scrap of information I could. I tracked her phone's GPS when I could, recorded her conversations, even checked her emails whenever I got the chance. I knew I was playing with fire, but I was past the point of caring. I had nothing left to lose. And then one night it happened. Sarah had left the house early, saying she'd be gone until late. By now, I knew better than to believe a word of it. I followed her in my car, keeping a safe distance as she made her way across town to an old, run-down warehouse district. I parked a few blocks away and watched as she met a man, tall, well-dressed, his face partially hidden by a hat. They stood close, talking in hushed tones, too quiet for me to hear. But then, to my shock, she handed him a large, sealed envelope. He tucked it into his coat pocket and walked away, leaving her standing there alone. I had to know what was inside that envelope, but I wasn't about to blow my cover by storming over and demanding answers. Instead, I waited, keeping an eye on her until she finally got back in her car and drove home. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept thinking about the man, the envelope, and the messages I'd read on her phone. She was paying this man for something that involved me, something she'd gone to great lengths to keep hidden. And I had a terrible feeling that whatever she'd planned was only just beginning. The next day, I made a decision. I was done playing defense. If she thought she could pull this off without a hitch, she was in for a rude awakening. Whatever her plan was, I'd find it, expose it, and then, well, I'd make sure everyone knew exactly who Sarah really was. I was going to dismantle her entire scheme piece by piece. And when it was all over, there'd be nothing left for her to hide behind. After watching Sarah hand that envelope to a stranger in a dimly lit part of town, I knew I couldn't sit back any longer. Whatever she was planning, she was moving fast, and I didn't have the luxury of waiting around. I needed to act, and I needed to be smart about it. She thought she could keep this hidden, but she'd underestimated me. Over the next few days, I made it my mission to stay one step ahead. I started by searching for any information about her new friends. Tom had managed to track down some details on the man I'd seen her meet in the warehouse district, a man named Ben Marcus. Turns out, Benjamin Fine was just an alias. This Ben Marcus was involved in several consultancy operations that, as Tom put it, handled things off the record. Nothing was official, but it was enough to prove he was the sort of man you'd hire if you wanted a problem to quietly disappear. It was becoming clearer. Sarah wasn't just hiding an affair. She was orchestrating something far more elaborate, and the stakes were higher than I'd realized. Now, it was a matter of finding out exactly how far she was willing to go. The messages on her phone had been cryptic but disturbing, implying there was more to her plans than I'd initially thought. I started using the GPS tracker Tom had helped me install on her car. Each time she claimed she was working late, I tracked her movements. More often than not, she'd end up in places that made no sense. Isolated parking lots, out-of-the-way restaurants, or even the back alley of a hotel I didn't recognize. I'd watch from a distance, never close enough to be seen, but always observing, piecing together the scope of her activities. One evening, while she was out with friends, I decided to search her office again, this time with a bit more determination. I knew she kept a small safe in her closet, and I was willing to bet that whatever secrets she had left were in there. I remembered she'd once told me her mother's birthday was the passcode for her accounts, so I tried it on the safe. To my surprise, it clicked open. Inside, there were a few bank documents, some passports, and a stack of envelopes, all sealed and addressed to people I'd never heard of. But one envelope caught my attention. It was addressed to me. I held the envelope, feeling a mix of anger and curiosity. What had she planned for me? I debated opening it right there, but decided against it. I slipped it into my jacket pocket and locked the safe again, leaving everything else undisturbed. Later that night, alone in my study, I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a legal document, a draft divorce settlement. My heart stopped as I read through it. She was requesting full ownership of our house, most of our savings, and even half of my pension. She'd gone to the trouble of drafting this without so much as a hint to me, planning to take everything. But there was one line that sent a chill down my spine. She marked me as legally incapable of managing finances. She was building a case to have me declared incompetent. It wasn't just about leaving me. It was about dismantling everything I'd worked for, leaving me with nothing. The betrayal I felt was beyond words. This wasn't just about taking money or property. This was calculated, a plan to strip me of everything and leave me helpless, maybe even ruin my reputation in the process. She wanted to frame me as some kind of fool, someone unfit to control his own life. I could almost hear her laughing, the thrill she must have felt thinking she could get away with this. But as I sat there, stunned by the depth of her betrayal, I felt something else. A determination, a kind of clarity that I hadn't felt in years. I'd spent enough time waiting, enough time playing her game. If she was planning to take me down, I'd make sure she fell with me. The next morning, I set a plan into motion. I made copies of the document and sent them to Tom, who assured me that he'd keep them safe. Then I called a friend of mine, Henry, a former attorney who had recently retired. I didn't go into detail, but I told him I suspected Sarah was planning to pull something underhanded. He agreed to meet with me the next day to discuss my options. Knowing I had people in my corner made me feel a little less vulnerable, as if I finally had some control in this twisted game. That evening, I kept my act up. I greeted Sarah with a smile, asked about her day, played the part of the clueless husband as she recounted some mundane story. But inside, I was miles away, every moment spent calculating my next steps. A few days later, I got a call from Tom. "Mike, I found something interesting," he said, his voice low and cautious. "It looks like Ben Marcus isn't just some consultant. He's been involved in some, let's call them questionable cases. A few clients he's worked with have had sudden accidents or faced sudden legal issues that worked in his favor." My blood ran cold. "Are you saying Sarah hired him to set me up?" "It's a possibility," Tom said. "With her pushing for that divorce settlement and trying to paint you as incompetent, she could be planning to make a case against you. Maybe even make you look unstable. She might be gearing up for something big." That's when it hit me. Sarah wasn't just leaving me. She was setting me up to take the fall, likely for some false claims or accusations she'd been building over time. I realized then that my safety, my life even, might be on the line if I didn't act fast. "Mike," Tom said after a pause, "if you're serious about taking her down, we need to gather as much as we can and soon. I've got contacts who can help us get more information on her finances and communications. You've got to be ready for anything she might throw at you." "I'm ready," I said, feeling a new resolve. "Whatever it takes." That night, as Sarah slept, I went through her phone one last time, scrolling through her messages, photos, anything that might give me an edge. I found a few more cryptic messages to Ben, hinting at the final steps and making sure there were no slip-ups. She even mentioned having the papers ready by the end of the month. The pieces were starting to fall into place. She'd been planning this for a long time, carefully weaving a web to catch me in, making sure there was no way out once I was trapped. But now, I had the one thing she didn't know about, a growing collection of evidence that could turn the tables. I'd gather every scrap of information I could, and when the time was right, I'd pull the rug out from under her. In the meantime, I'd play along, give her the performance of a lifetime, pretending to be the man she thought she'd fooled. But I was done being her pawn. She wanted to strip me of everything I had? Fine. I'd be ready when the moment came, and I'd make sure she lost just as much, if not more. As I lay awake that night, a plan started forming. I'd dismantle her lies piece by piece, and I'd make sure the world saw exactly who she was by the time I was done. The more I uncovered, the more Sarah's plan took shape, and it was darker than I'd imagined. She wasn't just sneaking around with someone. She was paying Ben Marcus, a so-called consultant who specialized in making problems disappear. This wasn't about love or betrayal. It was a calculated move to dismantle my life. She'd been systematically building her case, and with each secret I discovered, her intentions became clearer. One Friday night, Sarah told me she'd be out with friends, her usual vague excuse. I couldn't sit back anymore, so I followed her. She drove across town to an upscale restaurant, one I knew we couldn't afford on our budget alone. After about an hour, she came out with Ben Marcus himself. They stood outside, talking in low tones, with Sarah gesturing animatedly before handing him an envelope. He took it, nodding as he slipped it into his coat pocket. They parted ways, and I tailed Ben to a sleek office complex on the edge of the city. Watching from a distance, I noted the location. There was something off about this whole arrangement. Sarah wasn't just hiding things from me. She was orchestrating something big. I went home, my mind racing, piecing together every clue, every hint, and every suspicious movement I'd tracked. It all pointed to one conclusion. She was planning to cut me out entirely, taking everything I'd built. The next day, I called Tom. She's out there paying off Ben Marcus, making plans I don't even fully understand yet, I said. What is she doing, Tom? She's setting you up, Mike, Tom replied, his tone grim. From everything we've gathered, she's not just aiming for a clean divorce. She wants it all. Your assets, the house, maybe even to make you look unstable. She's building a narrative where you're the problem. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words. Then we'll need to gather everything. This isn't just about catching her in an affair. It's about exposing the entire plan. As I hung up, a plan started to form. Sarah thought she'd fooled me, that she could carry this scheme through without a hitch. But I'd been watching, waiting, and now I had enough to start pulling the rug out from under her. The evidence was mounting, and soon enough, she'd see the walls closing in. The morning after I followed Sarah to meet Ben Marcus, I knew it was time to act. I'd gathered every piece of evidence: bank statements, emails, records of her payments to Ben, and even recordings of her conversations with him. The picture was clear. She crafted a careful plan to ruin me financially and personally, intending to walk away with everything I'd worked for. I spread the documents across the dining table, creating a wall of evidence she couldn't escape. This was it. After months of watching her lies unfold, I'd make her face every single one. That evening, when she walked in, Sarah froze at the sight of the documents. She looked from the table to me, her face pale. "What's this?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "This," I replied, "is everything you tried to hide from me. I know about Ben Marcus, the fake bank accounts, and the payments. I know about the divorce you planned to spring on me, hoping to leave me with nothing." I held up a bank statement showing a hefty payment to Ben. "Care to explain this?" She blinked, then quickly tried to mask her shock with a cold expression. "You're paranoid. I don't know what you think you know, but this is ridiculous," she said, her voice tinged with contempt. "Oh, really?" I replied calmly. "I have records of every payment you've made to Ben, records of meetings, even a draft of the divorce papers you were planning to file. So don't tell me I'm paranoid." She was silent, her mask cracking, but she wasn't done yet. I saw a flash of defiance in her eyes. "I did what I had to do, Michael. You were holding me back." "By what?" "Trusting you? Building a life with you." I shook my head. "You're not just ending our marriage. You've been trying to destroy me." Her expression shifted, almost as if she'd lost interest in keeping up the act. "You wouldn't understand. You were always too small-minded." Her words cut deep, but I refused to let her see it. Instead, I leaned forward, matching her coldness. "I understand that you underestimated me. You thought I wouldn't find out, but now everyone's going to know who you really are." I watched her face, her confidence finally crumbling. The truth was out, and there was no turning back for her now. For the first time, I felt a weight lift. She had planned, plotted, and lied, but in the end, she'd only trapped herself. After the confrontation, I knew the truth would soon ripple through every part of Sarah's life. I had warned her that she wouldn't be able to hide anymore, and now, the reality of her actions was finally catching up. With all my evidence in hand, I filed for divorce, including every document that showed her deception, her hidden accounts, and her plan to ruin me. My attorney assured me we had a solid case. "You've got enough here to block her from taking anything more than what she came in with," she said confidently. "She can try to counter, but it's not likely she'll win after this." Over the following weeks, the fallout from Sarah's lies unfolded. Word quickly spread among her friends and family, most of whom had no idea what she had been doing. Her sister called me one evening, apologizing for not believing me sooner and expressing her shock at Sarah's betrayal. Even her parents reached out, clearly disappointed and disturbed by their daughter's actions. The image Sarah had tried so carefully to construct was unraveling, and for the first time, I saw her mask completely fall away. Then came her job. I decided to share certain documents with her employer, ones that clearly showed her hidden accounts and questionable financial dealings with Ben Marcus. Her position required a spotless reputation, and once they reviewed the evidence, it was only a matter of time before she was let go. She was furious, of course, but there was nothing she could do. Her plans to escape with financial security had collapsed. Finally, on the day of our divorce hearing, Sarah sat in silence as the judge reviewed the evidence. When it was over, she was granted nothing more than her personal belongings. She left the courtroom with a hollow expression, the weight of her losses visibly heavy on her shoulders. I watched her go, feeling a mixture of relief and finality. There was no more anger, just a calm acceptance that I was free. After the divorce, I sold the house and moved to a quieter town, finding a small place near a lake where I could start over. My days became simple, peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past year. I reconnected with old friends, took up hobbies I'd forgotten about, and finally felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. Looking back, I realized that Sarah's betrayal had given me a strange gift: clarity. I'd been living in the shadow of her lies, but now I had my life back, honest and free from deception. And while I'd never wished to relive the pain of that betrayal, I was grateful for the strength I'd found through it. For anyone who might find themselves in my shoes, my advice is simple: trust your instincts, gather your evidence, and take back control of your life. As for Sarah, I don't know what became of her, but I doubt she'll ever find the peace she tried so hard to steal from me.